around them. Many of you on this webinar fall into that category. But these are really difficult problems to solve. And I remember a few years ago, a county commissioner said to me something along the lines of, you know, Dennis, this growth management stuff isn't rocket science. It's more difficult than rocket science. So know that we really appreciate all of you that are working on these issues, and know that it really, it informs and inspires us here at Future West. But considering what's at stake, our highly livable, historic communities full of character, our wide open working landscapes, and our spectacular natural areas, we really feel like we need to take whatever steps are necessary to meet this challenge. Of course, knowing what those steps are is another story. And obviously there's no one magic bullet, and that's why we've teamed up with a number of people to host this series of webinars on several of what we consider to be some of the more salient growth management topics facing the Northern Rockies. Over the course of the next year, these webinars will cover topics like how to be a successful community, why patterns of growth affect our wallets, how can we conserve our agricultural landscapes, can we link growth management with affordable housing, how do we replicate traditional neighborhood design and new development, is there a nexus between non-regulatory and regulatory approaches to conserving rural landscapes? Can cities and towns grow in a more coordinated manner? And why are downtowns so important to community well-being? So these and other topics will be explored during the course of these webinars. And really, our goal is to inform and inspire local actions by both governmental and non-governmental entities. You know, listening to these topics, I think you get the message that some of them relate to rural land protection, others to community development, but we believe they're all interrelated and they form pieces of this Northern Rockies growth management puzzle. Now, you may or may not agree with everything our presenters have to say, but we do hope that their presentations stimulate further discussions between you and your colleagues and within your community that ultimately lead to concrete action on the ground. So to kick off this series, we are really excited to host two well-known individuals in the conservation biology community who will be addressing the issue of rural sprawl in the Northern Rockies and its impacts on wildlife. Our first speaker is Dr. Andy Hansen. Andy is a professor in the ecology department at Montana State University and the director of their biodiversity lab. He teaches macroecology to undergrads and landscape ecology to graduate students. With funding from NASA, Andy's really been a pioneer in the study of land use and climate change impacts on large landscapes and protected areas. He's widely published, and we are really lucky to have him in our community. Andy will be followed by Brent Brock, who's a conservation biologist with the Wildlife Conservation Society. Brent has over 30 years of experience in applying GIS in the fields of ecology and conservation, most recently developing tools to improve land use planning to minimize impacts of rural sprawl on wildlife. And he's also very focused on finding ways to preserve working landscapes and improve wildlife stewardship practices on private lands. So before Andy gets started, I want to introduce my colleague, Allison Berry. Allison will be moderating the Q&A portion of this, which will follow immediately after Andy and Brent's presentation. So Allison, take it away.
Great, thanks, Dennis. Yeah, I'm excited to be here today, and we have more than 100 people in attendance, and more are sort of filtering in. So thanks to everyone for joining us. I just wanted to remind folks to ask your questions through the Q&A panel on your screen. You can do that at any time, but as Dennis mentioned, we will address the questions after both of the speakers have completed their presentations. I will also try to keep an eye on the chat, but the Q&A will be sort of the main focus for the questions for our panelists. So that's all I really needed to add, and I will go ahead and turn the controls over to Andy. And Andy, you can go ahead and bring up your presentation.
Thanks very much, Allison and Dennis. Yeah, Andy Hansen here. Co-authors on this talk are Katrina Mullen, Dave Theobald, Scott Powell, Nathaniel Robinson, and Allie East. You probably know some or all of those folks. Our title is Towards Sustaining Natural Habitats on Private Lands. We're just finishing a 5-year study and thought you might like to see some of the results from this work. I'll first provide a context or a background on the issue of natural habitats and their loss, and then report our findings on 3 particular questions, and then wrap up with some conclusions. Thanks so much to Future West for convening this really important educational series. And thanks to all of you that are participating here. Together, hopefully we can have the conversation and actions that lead to a good future. Well, our region is certainly famous for its vast wilderness ecosystems and intact wildlife communities. These are due in part to the expansive public land system that we have and to what were low population densities. But of course, human population is increasing rapidly now, and it's resulting in land development and habitat loss. Strangely, we don't have good knowledge on the rates of this loss, driving factors, and importantly, which places are perhaps the highest priorities for conservation based on their ecological value and based on the risk of loss. So we're focused on natural habitats in this talk. They're particularly important because they are really, of course, the backbone of the US and global conservation strategies. And that's because they provide a variety of ecosystem services, as including those that are listed here. They're mostly on public land, but it might be of interest to know that that those natural habitats that remain on private land are often more valuable ecologically even than those on public land. And that's because they often have more fertile soils and more favorable climate, and have higher productivity rates and support more native species. Just to illustrate that, this map is looking up the Gallatin watershed from the Gallatin Valley to Yellowstone Park. In red are what we've identified as breeding bird hotspots, places of very high numbers of species. And of course, the map is illustrating that it's not so much in the park where we have these hotspots, but particularly on the private lands, on the valley bottoms and the toe slopes of the mountains. Just illustrating the importance of those private habitats on natural, those natural habitats on private lands. We define natural habitat based on vegetation cover, basically identifying places that are dominated by natural vegetation and do not show signs of intense human activity such as residential development or urban or ag or proximity to human infrastructure. So of course, this photograph would illustrate natural vegetation cover. The vegetation in and around these rural homes would not qualify under this definition. And that's because we've learned that across the land use gradient from wildlands through rural residential through urban, we see declines in the abundances of native species and increases in weedy species and invasive species. And as a consequence, there's basically a zone around each rural subdivision or rural home of degraded habitat, as illustrated here around the Little Bear subdivision just south of Bozeman, where these invasive species and others tend to reduce diversity of native human-sensitive species, and things like pets have large impacts on wildlife. It might surprise you that we know more about these issues internationally than we do within the US, that the human footprint has been well quantified, covering some 42%. So some 42% of the terrestrial Earth is relatively free from human pressure. And that area is declining relatively rapidly as development progresses. Fortunately, though, there are important global conservation policies in place that many countries are participating in that are trying to meet targets to protect biodiversity by 2020, 2030, 2050. The US, on the other hand, currently has no national biodiversity policy. We have not yet been able to map natural habitats in private lands, largely due to the inability to see rural homes on satellite images. And the rates and drivers of habitat loss are not well quantified. On the bright side, conservation easements have become an incredibly important vehicle for protecting natural habitats on private lands. And they're expanding pretty dramatically in terms of area. These easements have declared purposes, including open space, ag, land protection, scenic value, water quality, recreation. And among these purposes is that for wildlife habitat and natural ecosystems. And it's particularly that purpose that we focus on in this talk. Also, amazingly, we now are on the edge of the US developing a national strategy to try to conserve 30% of lands and waters by 2030. What a fantastic new development. And so all of this leads to the goal of our work in this talk really being to try to provide information that can just forward the discussion on how to conserve natural habitats and how to slow their rates of loss. So specifically, we ask, where are those remaining natural habitats? What's the risk of loss in the future of these places? Which of these are most important ecologically, most at risk, and thus high priorities for conservation? And then, to what extent are conservation easements being placed in the areas that are scored as high priorities? This is the study area. It includes the mountain portions of Colorado, Wyoming, and Montana, and then Idaho, Washington, Oregon. The purple here is showing the private lands. They cover about 35% of this area. And the dark lines here are showing what we call socioecological regions. They're basically ecoregions that consider social factors as well as biophysical. And we did analysis at the scale of the entire study area as well as within these regions. Here, for example, is the Greater Yellowstone region and the High Divide region. I'm going to largely omit discussion of methods and just mostly talk about what we've been learning. So here, for example, relative to the first question is, as far as I know, the first map of natural vegetation cover on private lands across this study area. It's for 2011. That's the most recent period when the data are available to do this work. Within the coming year, there will be data for 2020, and it's important to do an update at that time. The green here are the private lands that are in this natural vegetation cover. The black are the developed private lands, and then yellow are agricultural private lands. About 62% of these private lands remain in natural cover, so the majority are still natural. That's a pretty important point. But proportions vary a bunch. In like the Blue River ecoregion, for example, almost 90% is in natural cover, but in Western Washington, it's only about 12%. It's a big variation. This map is showing for three key areas, the area around Bend, the area around Bozeman, and then the Colorado Mountains. Natural vegetation cover on private lands in dark green, and the natural cover on public lands in light green. And it's meant to illustrate just visually that private lands play a pretty important role, that in terms of the actual aerial extent of natural vegetation cover, it's considerable on private lands, and it might be really important for connectivity, for example, between Yellowstone and the Crown of the Continent ecosystem. We've been quantifying the rates of loss during this 10-year period, 2001 to 2011, across the study area. It's about 3% of the natural cover has been lost in that time. But again, the rates vary, and on the west side of the Cascades, it's as high as 12% during that 10-year period. And then these are three particularly fast-changing places. Again, Bend, the Spokane, Coeur d'Alene area, and again around Bozeman. And you'll note that big losses, of course, around Big Sky during the early 2000s, and the Paradise Valley around Immigrant. And then a picture tells a story better than a map maybe, but this is just a Google image of looking south from Bozeman Pass area, Highway 90, and we can see the very extensive road network that's leading up to rural homes across this area, and the Bozeman Pass area, as we'll see, is one that's particularly important ecologically. So this development of natural habitats is very real. The amoeba map is actually one I think you'll find quite interesting. These blobs are what we call city spheres. They are the commuting zones around cities of 50,000 or more. So for example, Kalispell is in the middle of this, and the blob is that commuting distance around it. There are 88 of these in the study area. And we were interested in, on a per person basis, which of these communities are protecting habitat and which are destroying habitat on a per person basis. Here's the list of the top ones among the 88. Butte, number 3, Kalispell, Helena, Cody, Bozeman. So among, almost 90, some of the local communities here close to Bozeman are right in the top group. So, we are at the heart of this issue. That's, I think, critically important relative to this talk and this session and to the overall Future West series. What is it about these communities and these in particular parcels that are associated with the development that might be good predictors of the development? Well, we did quite rigorous statistical analysis and found that at the level of these city spheres, it's those that are closer to urban markets that have the higher development rates, New West demographics, high rates of previous development, and then regarding natural amenities, close to national parks and with a lot of variation in topography, which probably relates to views. And at the plot level, it's those that are near existing development, like highways and suburban areas, but also a mix of forest and non-forest, close to rivers and lakes and close to state land. Okay, so we use these as predictors in a statistical model to basically say for the area, for conditions in 2011, again, this last period when we have data, what's the probability of future development? And this map is showing that. We largely see that west of the Cascade Crest, the development rates are high. Coeur d'Alene, Spokane area, Wasatch Front, Colorado Mountains. Moving on to the second question relating to conservation priority, we first quantified ecological value by using 5 data layers that relate to primary productivity, to numbers of native vertebrate species. For ecosystem types, how well they're represented in protected areas, and then numbers of imperiled species, and then finally, connectivity, contributions of connectivity among large protected areas. And we integrated these into a single map of ecological value. This is showing the relative ecological value across the study area, with the dark reds being the top 5% of natural habitats in terms of high ecological value. So again, it's done relatively, so we can say one place has higher value than another place. And then this is the probability of development from that statistical analysis expressed on this relative scale. Again, and then here's the big map. This is where now we combine them with the logic that if we're going to spend conservation dollars wisely, we probably should spend them for the places that'll give us biggest bang in terms of biodiversity, and protect the places that are most likely to be lost to development. And so again, we see that it's this Western Oregon, Washington area, Spokane, Coeur d'Alene region, that Wasatch Front, the Colorado Mountains that are high. These are just plots that are quantifying within each ecoregion this priority index. It's pretty notable that the Wyoming Basin is fairly low, Greater Yellowstone is fairly low, High Divide, Snake River Plains. And that's partially because of the vast extent of public lands in this area. And again, it's at the scale of the overall region. Now, a map like this might be important for the Nature Conservancy, who does conservation planning over the country, but a lot of you all are involved with conservation planning based on more local factors. You'd like to know within Greater Yellowstone, for example, where the places that perhaps are the highest priorities. And so we did the scoring additionally at the region scale. And so this is showing within each region the places that are highest and lowest based on values within that particular area. So again, if we zoom in on the Bozeman area, we can look at the priority maps based on the study area scale and based on the Greater Yellowstone scale. With, in this case, the greens being low index, low priority, and the reds being high. And it's that Bear Canyon Bozeman Pass area that's particularly high. This is the Bridger Range, and both the Bangtails to the east and the west side of the Bridgers are also high relative to the study area scale. And for Greater Yellowstone, pretty much the same patterns. It's notable that the Bangtails are high mostly because of quite high ecological value. The west side's high mostly because of high development potential. So different reasons for the high scores. And then the Gallatin Front comes in as high as well. So maps like this just help us visualize, this notion that through an objective classification, some places score quite a bit higher than others, and maybe these are the places that we ought to target conservation. And then finally, what about conservation easements? Well, we drew on this national database to identify where are the easements. Only about 70% of the easements in the country are in this database, so it's not complete, but it's the best available. And we pretty much tried to identify those easements that have the purpose of habitat protection as compared to the other types of easements and the places that do not have easements. We found that some interesting things, that just under 5% of the private lands across the study area are within some type of easement, that about a third of those easements are aimed at habitat protection. But when you look at natural vegetation cover on private lands in an easement for habitat protection, that's just 2%. 2%. Can we increase that is the big question of the day. And then these are just showing the distribution of the different easement types relative to conservation priority. You can see they overlap a bunch. So this pinkish color is those that are aimed at habitat, and then green are the other types of easements, and then the blue are places that are not protected. You pretty much see that the easements aimed at natural habitats actually are distributed such that they're a little bit lower in conservation index, priority index, than even unprotected places. So we're largely not targeting these places identified as high priority in the existing easement structure. And so to draw some conclusions, yeah, we have a lot of really important natural habitat on private lands. We're losing them quickly. In many cases, the loss rates are highest in the sort of communities that perhaps have the best capacity and motivation to conserve them. We do need to redo this analysis because we all know that the last year has probably pushed all this way harder due to COVID demographics. The easement system is really an important instrument in all this. I want to point out that protecting these natural habitats is not only important for biodiversity, which I'm emphasizing here, but it really is important with regard to the people living with fire and controlling the costs of that, to the cost of services, as Dennis mentioned in the introduction, and to mitigating climate change through carbon storage. There's all kinds of really important reasons to maintain these places. I guess I'm hoping that this priority index will find a variety of uses. For example, helping conservation ranch buyers select places that will do the most good for conservation, help local governments to consider conservation when they make land use decisions. especially for identifying places for conservation easements, and then to contribute to the private land component of this emerging national conservation strategy. So those are all potential uses. And then finally, in terms of the big take home, I guess, you know, if in fact it's communities like ours that are most responsible for the loss of these habitats, when we have this high motivation, most of us are here because of nature. Many of us are anyways. We have a high level of wealth in the communities. We have a high level of capacity. Can't we do a better job of sustaining these places? And I guess that leads to the really what I think is the question of the day is, and that is, how do we best conserve these remaining critically important places in the face of the incredible pressure we're getting from population growth and development? How do we maintain the natural heritage of these places that are so important to us? I'm hoping that through this series, some really good solutions will emerge. And so with that, I thank you so much for your time. The funding sources for this work are here, and for more information, you can go to my webpage or just email me, and I'm happy to send you these publications that are being developed. And so I think with that, we go over to Brent. Thank you.
Sandy, that was fantastic. Let's see here. I think I shared the wrong thing. Sorry. All right. So first I want to thank Future West for initiating this series. Like Andy said, I hope it leads to some discussion and more importantly, some solutions that are out there. And also I want to say I'm extremely honored to follow and be paired with Andy on this. Andy's really been a leader in this field, and you know, the work that I do wouldn't be possible without Andy and people like him doing the work that they do. So I'm really following on the coattails there. And I also want to give a shout out to the Craighead Institute. A lot of the work that I'm going to show you here today actually occurred at a time when I was working with the Craighead Institute, and I did see that April is on the call today. So hi, April, and you're probably going to recognize some of the slides that you see here today. But yeah, I want to start out with just, you know, a little bit of honest exposure here and a confession in that, you know, these are the kinds of landscapes that Andy was talking about, and that's my house right there. And I recognize there's a bit of hypocrisy in that I live in this landscape. And not only is that my house, but that's in that Bozeman Pass area that Andy just talked about how important it was regionally for wildlife. You know, I grew up in the suburbs and I've lived in cities, and you know, I'm just not wired for that kind of an environment. And I bring this up not as an excuse for living where I live, but that we need to acknowledge that this is complicated, and the solutions are going to be hard. They're going to require sacrifices. And I think we start by acknowledging the impacts that we have if we choose to live in an area like this, and figure out ways to make sure that we keep them functioning or keep them unoccupied so that wildlife can do their thing. So. And I'm going to start at the very broad scale, and then we're going to zero down very, very deeply at the micro scale in this. And so the first thing we need to acknowledge is that, you know, as Andy showed in his presentation, nature operates at pretty large scales. And what we're looking at here in this slide is this line of Wolverine habitat across the northern Rockies in the lower 48 states. So the green areas are habitat for wolverine that occur mainly at high elevations, and they occur in this island shape or island-like form where the wolverines are up high. And what we know about wolverines are that, you know, they're kind of congregated into these three great ecosystems of our region: the greater Yellowstone, the northern continental divide, and then the central Idaho Salmon Selway Wilderness Complex. But none of these areas on their own are large enough to support a population of wolverines that has the genetic diversity necessary to survive for the long time. So in order for wolverines to survive in this region, they have to be able to move between these different landscapes to exchange genes, and also exchange genes with populations farther north into Canada. So we need to recognize the scale that nature needs when we're planning for it, and understand what things we can do to maintain this important connectivity and minimum areas needed for wildlife. And if we map the connectivity for those wolverine across the landscape, if you map it at a continental scale, you see a map something like this, where you see broad swaths of habitat connectivity or potential connectivity across the landscape. And that's all interesting and tells us something about where they might move, but it really doesn't give us the detail that we need to make decisions on the ground. And if we move over to this map on the lower left, we zoom into a regional scale, and then you can see things like the Madison Valley lights up as of the highest priority for connectivity across that region. Well, that's interesting to know as well too, but it's still not quite at the level that we need to be able to make decisions. And if we zoom in even farther, you see that the connectivity is not evenly distributed across the Madison Valley. It's mainly concentrated in this southern region, just downstream from Quake Lake up to about Papoose Creek, and then across this northern area north of Ennis Lake across North Meadow Creek. But we're going to see in a minute that even that is not fine enough detail to make some of the decisions that have to be made on the landscape. So, you know, these broad areas matter, but the details also matter too. And so a number of years ago, when I was with Craighead Institute, I was having a lot of conversations with Doris Fisher, who was the Madison County planner at the time, and a number of other people, and talking about, well, what kind of tools can we develop to help planners understand what the impacts of subdivisions like this may have on wildlife, and hopefully improve the planning process. So the first thing to do is to dig into the literature, and Andy actually already showed you this slide. I wasn't sure if he was going to show it, and I was going to make sure that it got into this into this presentation. But you know, the first thing you see as you dig into the literature is there's a common theme that as housing densities increase, the richness and abundance of native species decreases, and the richness of abundance of weedy species and human adapted species increases. So that's the impact. And then another common theme is that the impacts of development on wildlife expand beyond the footprint of the development itself. There's this zone of influence that occurs around those development areas, and it impacts different species disproportionately, and it even impacts individuals within species disproportionately. But there are these zones of influence that kind of permeate across the landscape, that radiate out from the development itself. And then thirdly was a paper that Dave Theobald published quite a few years ago that showed that the patterns of development can have a major influence on the cumulative effects of those zones of influence. Clustered developments tend to create overlapping zones of influence that affect wildlife and therefore reduce the overall footprint of development. So based on these things, we came up with some metrics that were then measurable and mappable that we thought could be used in some tools that could help with development. So developed a suite of tools that operate in a GIS, and we won't go into any details here, but they're designed to be fairly simple, to just ask some very basic things about, what are the requirements for the species or group of species that you're interested in looking at? What are the sources of disturbance for that species? What are their sensitivities to that disturbance? And where are the suitable habitats for them? And from that, we can do different things like look at amount of habitat that's left over. And the other thing that these tools do is they kind of flip what Dave Theobald did around and analyze not just the zone of impact that we have, but what's left over. And is that sufficient to be able to support the wildlife that we're interested in supporting in a post-development world? And just to give an example of the phenomena that Dave Theobald illustrated, we did a little bit of analysis with one of the tools in Madison Valley. We just arbitrarily picked an area out there, and we compared the impacts of the current development on projected future development on elk. And so at the time, we used a disturbance distance that made sense at the time. Now we've got data to know that the zones of influence that we applied in this analysis were actually way too small. They're much larger than that, but this still illustrates the point. In 2007, there were roughly 80 some houses within this oval area. And so when you map that out and then you map those zones of disturbance around the areas that have been developed, around the roads and around the houses, you get this pattern, and the green areas are areas that still remain, that were outside of those disturbance zones and met the criteria for security cover for elk as defined and used commonly by state and federal agencies for managing elk. The brown areas are undisturbed, but they no longer meet that criteria for security habitat. And in 2007, about 61% of the area fell within this, undisturbed secure habitat criteria. And then we used a model that was developed by a former student of Andy's, Patricia Hernandez, who projected what future growth might look like in 2035. And under her projection, there would be basically a doubling of the number of houses in this area. But that model, the most important predictor for future development is the location of current development. So that model naturally clusters the development across the landscape. And so under that projection, there was about a doubling of the number of houses, but only about, because they were clustered next to existing development, only 1% of this conserved area was lost under that. And just as a thought exercise, I just popped in a 9-unit development in here, just a hypothetical development out in the hinterlands to simulate one of these spot fire developments we see across the landscape. And those 9 units consumed another 1% of the elk habitat that was available in that area. So those 9 units unclustered had the same impact as 81 clustered houses in this. So just to show clustering does work, it does reduce the cumulative footprint. Now, what do I mean by disturbance in these? So I'm going to give you a personal example here. So again, this is my house, in an area where we really like to not see homes, but they're there nonetheless. When we moved in, moose were extremely abundant in this area, and this area along here is a riparian area that was kind of a nexus for movement for the moose. So almost on a daily basis, we had moose moving back and forth across this landscape, roughly across these pathways that I have indicated here. It was common to see bulls congregate in this area. For the rut, we could see as many as 7 moose at a time. And then a neighbor put in a jackleg fence to corral in a horse in this area right here, which is right into this nexus. And for about a 3-year period when that fence was there, we saw no movement of moose at all. They didn't come down into this area at all. Instead, they moved back and forth across the ridge lines on both sides, but the movement across these multiple lots in this region just simply ceased. And then after about 3 years, that neighbor moved away and took the fence with them. Oh, and here is a photo of the one sighting during that 3 years of a moose. This is a cow that paced back and forth across that fence for about 45 minutes before she finally found a way around and moved on. Then the neighbor moved out, the fence disappeared, and within weeks, the moose started using this travelway again. Here's a picture of that same cow that is bedded down just up behind our house in that area. But this just illustrates that, you know, stewardship of these areas is very difficult because the actions of one landowner impact much larger than the area. You know, those impacts don't stop at the property line. And so in order to improve stewardship in these low density developments, you really need to get everybody on board. And I wish I could tell you that the ending to this story was happy, but no, since this occurred, you know, there's been more fences that have gone in, more outbuildings have gone in, and moose still move through that area, but it's pretty rare now. So there's definitely an impact that's occurring in that area. And again, just to emphasize, these zones of influence are important. Now, that's just one small example on the landscape. So a couple months ago, I just did a thought exercise thinking about this at a landscape scale. And so, you know, how pervasive are these disturbance activities that we have on the landscape? So I just thumbed through some papers that I had at hand on my desktop. And I started jotting down the disturbance distances that have been reported for elk from different human activities. And then I mapped those out for Western Montana. And so the first is the disturbances around existing homes. And that's what that looks like on the landscape. And you can see that we have pretty well filled up the valley bottoms. And the valley bottoms are these important areas that are connectivity between mountain ranges. They're the winter ranges for the game species. They also contain the sagebrush and grassland habitats that contain a disproportionate number of declining species. And those, by and large in this region, are falling under a disturbance envelope of one or more structures on the landscape. Next, I overlaid the road network. And so here's what the road network looks like. And you can see that there's more disturbance across the landscape. But we do see, you know, these areas of wilderness and roadless areas that still provide some vacant areas. But then when we throw in recreational trails on top of that, we see this pervasiveness of these disturbance envelopes. Now, you know, this is not scientific by any means. To understand what this is really telling us, we need to dig down much deeper and understand the nuances. Not all roads and not all trails are created equal. But this should at least have us sit back and take notice that, you know, our activities across this landscape are rather pervasive, and we're already asking our wildlife to tolerate quite a bit of human activity on the landscape. And we need to wonder about, you know, where are the thresholds of tolerance and what can we do to minimize this and make sure that we continue to have the abundance of wildlife and the diversity of wildlife that we enjoy in this region. So moving beyond that, then I'm going to dig into some examples of the tools themselves that we've used. So here is one analysis that was used to demonstrate, you know, what future scenarios may look like. What we're looking at here is the Madison Valley. We have applied a 500-yard disturbance envelope around homes in this region, which is, you know, roughly approximates reports that have been reported for grizzly bears that show that mortality rates can increase when they are within about 500 yards of roads. And so we applied that disturbance distance, mapped that across the Madison Valley, and then we ran a connectivity model across there to show where the pathways of quiet spaces for grizzlies to move across would occur. And 70% of this area is under conservation easement. I don't know how well they show up on everyone's screens, but these white crosshatched areas are all under conservation easement. So those are protected from future development. But you know, you can see that the pattern of the development that occurred at the time that we did this analysis had already blocked off a lot of the edges around the area, and there were only a few quiet spaces left for bears to move across the valley. So it created these bottlenecks. And then the next stage was to look at, well, what's already been subdivided but not developed on the landscape. And so the right panel shows that scenario. What would happen if every subdivided lot that existed at the time in the Madison Valley had a home placed on it? So we just placed a home in the center of each of those lots, reran the analysis, and what it indicates is that there essentially, other than one area up toward the north, there would be no complete linkages across that valley where bears could move that would be beyond these disturbance zones of homes. Now, that doesn't mean that a bear couldn't get through there, but you know, when you're asking them to move through landscapes that are developed like that, it's just that many more barbecues to attract their attention. That's that many more bird feeders to raid, more apple trees, just more opportunities to create problems. And you know, oftentimes problems with grizzly bears means the grizzly bears get removed, and so they're no longer part of that system. They're not able to continue to expand their range and restore their populations into currently unoccupied habitats. So that's one example of looking at this very fine scale of how our development patterns are influencing those broad landscape connectivity regions that show up on those broader scale models. But you know, when you really start to look at our development patterns, it shows you know, how important this problem is, that we need to figure out a way to maintain those quiet spaces for wildlife to be wild across the landscape. So building upon that, we use this same analysis, and I worked with Dennis and others at Future West and then Clark Wheeler Associates, and we embarked on a project to see if we could use these types of analyses to secure those remaining bottlenecks for movement, to secure some complete pathways that would provide opportunities for wildlife to move through the quiet spaces across that landscape. So this again is that, you know, current connectivity model that we looked at before. And then from that, we identified where are the high priority linkage areas. So in this map, what we have is the red and the orange areas are high priority areas for connectivity that are under threat of being lost if the existing parcels were developed on that landscape. The green areas are priority areas for connectivity, but because of the existing easements, future development does not threaten those areas. Those are going to remain quiet regardless of the development pattern that occurs. So these red and orange areas became the priorities. And from that, we identified a series of parcel packages that could be potentially secured. And if safe passage through those areas could be secured, then, you know, each of these packages would represent a complete connected pathway across the Madison Valley that would provide that quiet space that was needed. Now, I wish I could report that we were incredibly successful in this, but we were not. As you can see, this is a lot of parcels, and you know, it takes just as much work and just as much expense to negotiate a deal for a 10-acre parcel as it does for a 1,000-acre parcel. And so when you have this many landowners and this small of parcels, it just becomes very, very difficult. And we knew that going in, but we had to try anyway. And in the end, there were no deals to be made in this area. And what it really illustrates is that if we want to maintain these quiet areas, we need one of two things. We either need to develop new tools to be able to address this type of situation where you have parcels that are on the land that have not been developed yet. So they represent an opportunity to accommodate wildlife, but it's going to be difficult. Or we need to get involved much earlier in the process, get serious about land use planning so that we can assure that as development progresses through time, that we still leave these quiet spaces available for wildlife to move through the landscape, to live on the landscape, and to keep our wildlife wild. I'm going to end on one note that's a little bit of a lesson for those of us who do live in these more natural and low, lightly populated areas. When humans build in a landscape, we tend to make clearings in areas where we think there's too many trees, or we plant trees in areas where we think there are not enough. And sometimes we get lucky in these areas that are naturally heterogeneous and have a mix of open spaces and forest and shrublands. That matches the pattern of our development fairly well. So a number of years ago, with some colleagues of mine at WCS and at Paul Smith's college, we developed a hypothesis that suggested that wildlife in areas that are have naturally heterogeneous habitat may be a little bit more resilient to human development than areas that are like closed canopy forest or open grasslands. And just last month, my colleague published a paper that actually confirmed that hypothesis, that landscape context does matter, that naturally heterogeneous areas do provide some resilience with respect to bird communities. We can't extrapolate this to mean that it means all wildlife, but also what they found was, in terms of stewardship, the factors that made the most difference in influencing the native bird communities within these ex-urban developed areas were the physical transformations that the landowners made on the landscape. You know, the fences that they put in, as I illustrated earlier with the example with the moose in my neighborhood, you know, how they planted their landscape, was it lawn? Did they plant trees in grassland areas, et cetera, et cetera? And the lesson from this is that, you know, one thing that we can do when we live in these areas is, you know, take it easy on the fences, be light on the landscape, and landscape in such a way that matches the surrounding habitat so that we create a more seamless environment and we're not creating these novel landscapes that then will attract non-native and human adapted species on the landscape. So it's one small thing we can do to not eliminate our impacts, but at least reduce them. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to our wonderful moderators here, and I hope we can have a really wonderful discussion.
Thanks, Brent and Andy. It was a great presentation. I got a lot of good positive feedback in the chat and in the questions panel, and we do have a few questions from our audience. So, and Andy did go ahead and answer some of them, typed in answers, but we have some also rolling in. And if folks have questions now, you can go ahead and type them in as well, and we'll get to as many as we have time for. One that came up during Andy's panel, and Andy suggested that maybe Dennis would have some answers to this one, but perhaps Brent could weigh in too. The question is, are folks aware of any recent reports or assessments about the comparison of costs of government service delivery for the open space or protected lands versus subdivision scenarios in the study area? So this came in during Andy's presentation, if that helps to clarify. Dennis, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Funny you should ask that question because our very next webinar on April 14th, also at 11 a.m., is going to focus exactly on that topic. And we've got a great presenter, Joe Minicosi, who is sort of the guru on evaluating the fiscal impacts of various patterns of growth, you know, ranging from urban development to rural development. And so whereas, this webinar focused on the biological impacts, the next webinar will look at how much growth patterns affect us in our pocketbooks. And Joe is known for being a really good storyteller with some really good graphics, and has actually done research on that topic in this region. So I think it will be really relevant. So again, April 14th for that presentation.
Great, thanks, Dennis. All right, another question about Brent's presentation here. What do you think would be the best way to get some of this information to landowners who are already in some of these areas about ways that they can have lower impacts on wildlife?
That's a great question, and something that I'm really interested in pursuing in my current position at Wildlife Conservation Society. One of the things that I've observed in this area is that there just isn't that much information that's available, and there's a lot of impact on wildlife that occurs that really doesn't need to from that lack of information. I don't really have answers about what the best way to do it is, other than I think that it's a wide open opportunity right now. And I can give an example as well too. So, for one example, obviously invasive weeds is an important problem in these rural subdivision areas. And people have gotten the message to be pretty serious about that, but they don't really understand how to identify what is an invasive weed and what is not. And I had a meeting with some of my neighbors many years ago, and we were talking about it, and the subject of sticky geranium came up, and I said, that's the favorite forage for moose during the summertime. And about half of the people said, oh, I've been spraying it. So there's some really simple information that's out there that's available, that should be made available for people to really improve their stewardship on the landscape. I think there's a lot of opportunities to do that, but first it's just to gather the information itself and be able to provide some guidebooks, I think would be a good start. But I think it really should have more one-on-one engagement. I'm really interested in developing stewardship communities that would get some sort of a certification out there if people went through a training and got on board. So I really think this is a valuable area, back to Andy's point about how important these ex-urban development areas are for wildlife in the area. We really need to put a lot more focus on stewardship.
Great. Okay, a question came in just during that last answer there. A lot of conservation easements include owners retaining limited development rights, such as building envelopes for one home on a parcel of 10 acres to a few hundred acres. How much is known about that type of development impacts and the effectiveness of easements set up for habitat conservation?
Again, could you repeat the core of the question?
Sure. I mean, it's basically asking about the effectiveness of easements set up for habitat conservation. These easements can include owners retaining limited development rights, and there is various size, for example, on 1 acre versus 100 acres. What is the sort of effectiveness of these different approaches to conservation easements?
So as far as I know, on the one hand, every effort helps, but on the other hand, there's too little research done on exactly what are the ecological consequences of different home densities and management techniques. And we need a lot more of that type of work. Short of having those studies, however, I do think it's important to recognize that when it comes to private lands, Those really are multiple use lands. Those are lands that people need to live on, grow food on, derive scenery from, recreate, as well as try to achieve biodiversity objectives. And so trying to do what one can on their, whatever their situation on the biodiversity front, you know, is very helpful. So that might mean, you know, for a large rancher trying to maintain riparian vegetation, for example. Deciduous woody vegetation that we know is so important in so many ways. For a rural homeowner, it might be, you know, trying to not have pets roaming freely and persecuting ungulates. It might be trying to control weeds. It might be xeriscaping. And for urban dwellers, we know a lot about the benefits of so-called backyard conservation, planting native species to attract pollinators and birds and so forth. And again, control water use. So to me, the real win-win is that there are a variety of ways to achieve some improvement in biodiversity that don't compromise the other multiple uses, the other uses of private lands. And the more we can let people know what those ways are to have a lighter touch on the land and to better sustain nature, and encourage people to use them, you know, the more progress we'll make.
Yeah, if I can add on to that too, conservation easements can specify where those development rights would be located within the easement. They don't always, but they can, so they can designate footprints. And to Andy's point, you know, we need more information. We need more research into, you know, what those impacts are so that we could provide more guidance for where those would be. I actually pulled a slide from my presentation just minutes before that showed an analysis that we did in the Future West project to actually identify where those disturbance zones within those parcels would be, so that if you did need to retain a development right on that, they were the areas that we thought would be the least impactful, not zero impact, but as Andy said, there's lots of ways to reduce the impact and improve, you know, the biological function of those areas. So, you know, easements are pretty flexible in being able to do that. It's a matter of having the information to employ those tools to the greatest effect.
Okay, another question on how can planners and planning boards access the information that you have on how land use planning efforts can incorporate this science into planning efforts? I think that would apply to either Brent or Andy's discussion.
Go ahead, Brent.
Oh, yeah, so the planning tools that I have are available. They're, you can contact me and I can get you a link to that. The problem with those tools is they've kind of been developed ad hoc through the years with minimal funding, and so the documentation for how to use them is pretty sparse. But that's something I would be really interested in working with someone to make those more widely available. And of course, any kind of slides or anything like that, you know, those are, you know, from other people's publications, so those are available as well too, and I can help chase those down.
Yeah, and I would just add that I'm not aware of a common database, a decision support system for serving this type of information. The state of Virginia, for example, has such a site, and it appears to be really well done, so that a whole variety of information relating to private land conservation is drawn together at that site. And hey, why don't we do that for this region? That would be one example of a big step forward. More specific to the work I presented, two comments. One, we'll be posting all of our data associated with our scientific publications, and I can get the link for that to you, to anybody that wants it. But secondly, I would really appreciate advice on, and I'm sure Brent would as well, where we could post these data in ways that you would use. So if you know of, so basically we're doing all this work because we want people to use it, and yet there are big hurdles between doing the work and actually getting into the hands of decision makers. So any advice you have in that or opportunities you see for that, I personally would love to know about.
And Andy just reminded me too. So Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks has a document called Recommendations for Subdivision Development for Wildlife. There's a lot of really useful information in that document as well too. So you can Google that, or you can again contact me, and I can make sure that you get access to it, or contact anyone with Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and they should be able to do that. So that's probably the best document we have at the time. But boy, I would echo what Andy said about a central database would just be wonderful.
Okay. So on that same topic, so this is more of a comment from our audience, but it says that the Jackson Hole Conservation Alliance produced a brochure for Teton County homeowners, informing them about their wild neighbors with sort of limited effectiveness. It sounds like it says they mentioned a recent high-profile case with a homeowner feeding grizzly bears. Shows that this information alone is not efficient. So there's clearly work to be done. I guess you guys would agree on that. And that, well, let me see. We have one more comment coming in, suggesting that connecting GIS specialists working with local governments to share some of the data could be one way to help getting this information out. That's basically the end of our questions here. So I just want to go ahead and thank our panelists for being here. And I want to remind our audience that this webinar is being recorded, and you will be able to access that. We'll send out a follow-up email to everyone who has registered for the webinar, and you'll be able to watch the recording or share it with your colleagues. And with that, I will just say thank you and hand the controls over to Dennis for closing remarks.
Sure. Well, I also want to echo Allison's thanks to Andy and Brent. You guys are doing great work, and I do think that's the million-dollar question. How do we take this knowledge and this information and make it available? And more than that, make sure that it actually gets used in not only our decisions on which lands to focus land trust work on, but also our land use planning efforts. And right, even as I speak, we have several communities and counties that are in the midst of land use planning, growth management, planning processes. And the public has certainly expressed their concern for the long-term well-being of our wildlife heritage. And we feel at Future West that land use planning has a very important role to play in that process. So hopefully we can improve the lines of communication between our scientists and our communities and our planning boards and our elected officials. Information is only valuable when it gets used. So thank you guys, and thanks to all of you who joined us today. Again, we really appreciate you taking time, and we know it's because you care about these issues. And many of you are doing great work in trying to keep the Northern Rockies the special place that it is. We hope that we see you again on April 14th for that Joe Minicozy webinar, and also at future webinars. And Have a great day. And if we don't see you on a future Zoom call or on the streets, we'll see you on April 14th. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks,
Thanks.
everyone.
Thanks.